And good evening, my frogs and frauleins, um, my friends and neighbors, and all you folkses out there. It is 6 o'clock, and our 1 week, only this week, earlier starting time. Although technically, because of daylight savings, I guess it's kind of the same starting time in a more cosmological sense, but hell, that's never been my strong suit anyway. So, lovely to see you all. It is Sunday night, and I've had an interesting and very pleasant day today. I hope you have had the same. And yes, it has been, as Kelly asked over here, full of fun and festivities. Indeed, and after I finish here, we are having a meal. We're bringing in a meal, and we're going to have a proper birthday dinner, and then do some other stuff. So I have no idea what yet. Maybe watch a movie. Anyway, so hello, Kelly. Nice to see you. Jerry, what's up? Good to see you too. Hello, Kristen. Hello, Mahmoud. Good to see you. Barb Ann, thank you for the birthday wishes. And Nancy, same thing. And Claudia, thank you all very much. Jeremy, hello, Jeremy. Yes, it is a nice shirt, isn't it? I was given this last year, I think by my son. Anyway, Emily, thank you. It's nice to be appreciated. Jared, thank you too. I am a lumberjack, Jerry, and I am okay. I sleep all night and I work all day. Actually, it's kind of the other way around. I work all night and sleep all day. So I guess I'm kind of a jumberlack, jack lumber, something like that. Anyway, Annie, hi, and happy birthday to me from Eastern Connecticut. Thank you very much. Regina, hello, good to see you too. Troy, I'm still having a nice birthday, but thank you. And Felina, yes, there were grand celebratory events today. One of them was that I was allowed to have a nap without any guilt, which was also good. Alexis, yeah, it is my birthday, so respect the old guy. And Helm, that's a new name. Hello, nice to have you. Justin, hi, pleasure to have you too. James, hello, James. Sin, hello, huzzah, huzzah. And Rochelle, thank you. Jim, hello, Jim. Penny, a pleasure. And Sean, yeah, you can have a nap too. You can have a nap while I'm reading. In fact, many other people will probably be doing that as well. So it will all work out nicely. Anyway, thank you so much. What a pleasure to hear from all of you. And it's that time again. So I'm going to go back to reading the story we were reading. For those of you who were not tuned in last night at the ridiculous hour that we do these nighttime things, since they're aimed more at the European folks in my friends list and my readers contingent, I'm reading a short story that still has never been published, which is an Ostenard short story called The Lady of the Wood. And it takes place, probably 50, 60 years or so before the events of the Dragonbone Chair, maybe even a bit older, because it features Camarus, Sir Camarus, when he is a very young knight. And yes, Alexis, I see you. And hi, Kenneth. It features Sir Camarus as a young man, and he has gone in search of the Lady of the Wood, who is, of course, as far as he's concerned, must be the Queen of the Fairies. And he has, in fact, met the closest thing to the Lady of the Wood that he is likely to find, who is Amaterasu, who is the Saansara, the sort of ritual leader and institutional memory of the Scythe. And she has said, well, he believes himself to be cursed by his black sword, Thorn. And she has already told him a couple of things that have confused him, but she has said she will help him with his issue if he helps her first. And she tells him that she needs him. There is a giant that he's already heard about, who is a threat to all of the people living around, including the mortals, and that this giant needs to be killed because he's a murderous monster. And so Camarus has gone by himself to the mountain, and Amarasu will not send any help with him and does not explain why. And she has sent him to the mountain where the giant lives, and with the instructions to slay it, which sounds rather out of character for Amarasu, but she has said that he has to do this for her, Amarasu, to help him, Chimerus. When he gets there, after a kind of disturbing walk up the mountain where he notices the skeletons of animals and people, both mortals and Scythi, kind of scattered around, giving very strong evidence that this is, in fact, yes, a murderous giant. He gets to the top. He is surprised by the giant who attacks him, who is, in fact, very large, one of the largest of the giants that anybody has seen. And, hi, Jay. And he then also discovers the rather disturbing fact that the giant has two heads, which is something he's never seen before. One of them seems to be not quite conscious. The other one seems to be mainly angry and murderous. And so he winds up getting in a fight with the giant. And I'm going to go back just a little bit to read the description of the giant again and the fight, so that you can get an idea as to what's going on if you didn't hear the previous part of the story, and then I'm going to finish the story. So again, that's a lot of words just spilling out like that. Again, this is The Lady of the Wood, and I am picking it up at about the halfway point. Ignoring the sharp ache in his chest, Chimerus backed in a wide circle, angling toward his fallen sword, as the monster plodded toward him, swiping at him with its terrible clawed hands. One of its heads peered at him with slitted eyes, watching his every move. It had hardly any neck, and the head seemed to grow straight out of the trunk, the gaping fanged mouth beginning just above the collarbone. The other head stood on a proper neck, but its eyes had rolled up beneath the lids like a blind beggar's, showing only white, and it wagged and bobbed as the giant moved, limp as a child's rag poppet. But the head with the red piggish eyes was most definitely awake, and even as Chimerus snatched up his black blade once more, the giant leaned toward him, opening the fanged mouth wide, and let out a stomach-curdling roar, spraying saliva and bits of carrion. It sprang toward him faster than he had expected from its bulk, and he found it all he could do to duck beneath the swinging arm and slice at its leg as he threw himself to the ground and scrambled out of the way. He struck deep enough to let out a freshet of blood, but it did not seem to slow the giant. The creature came at him again, so big it seemed to block the last of the afternoon's light. This time he could not even swing the long blade in time, and had to fling himself onto his stomach to avoid the great flailing hands. He crawled to one side, then leaped up and sprang out of the way again before the claws closed on his back. "There is no possible victory in this," he thought with growing fear. "Only slow death, and perhaps not so slow." He sprinted to the edge of the flat part of the ground that lay in front of the cavern mouth, bent and picked up a large stone kicked loose from the fire circle, then turned and threw it as hard as he could. It struck the giant's chest with a deep, loud thump. The beast roared again, a sound Chimerus felt in his guts as he grabbed up another rock and threw it. This time it flew higher and struck the monster on its snarling head, and its cry of rage this time had a note of frustration in it. "That is all I can do. Drive it deeper into fury. Perhaps it will make some mistake." But it was hard to imagine what sort of a mistake a monster so large could make that would give him any chance to survive. Still, that was the only path Chimerus could see that did not quickly end with his head twisted off his neck. But as he fought to stay out of the giant's grasp, running and throwing himself to one side, somersaulting, stopping when he could to pick up skull-sized stones and fling them at the creature, it quickly became clear that if this was all he did, the monster would outlast him. He was burning his strength in a wildfire of exertion, while the monster only plodded after him, tireless as some great siege machine, like something not even made of flesh and blood. Flesh and blood, he told himself. That was the only thing that might save him. The giant was many times his size, with muscle and hide thicker than that of the biggest Thrithing's bull, but it was still made of flesh. He might not be able to pick up a stone big enough to harm it, but he could see blood shining wetly in the hair of its leg where he had slashed it earlier. He could make it bleed, and if it bled enough, it would eventually weaken. Now, each time the great clutching hands came toward him, he slashed at them with thorn. He had no hope of doing any great damage, but only tried to punish the monster, to prick it and cut it until it was reluctant to reach toward him. When he could, he struck farther up its arms, hoping to open a vein that would bring greater bleeding. But the creature's corded limbs were covered in sinew and bristling hair, so that he felt as though he slashed at something no more susceptible than a leather vaulting horse stuffed with straw. Chimerus was grateful he was wearing light chainmail, but he was still wearying quickly with the effort of staying out of the monster's long reach. Several times already the creature's nails had caught in the links of his armor, and only an almost more than human effort had enabled him to pull free. Chimerus, self-elected outcast of the Benedrivine house, had labored as hard as any man who ever lived to become a great warrior, and his feats of strength were talked about wherever fighting men gathered, but he was battling a creature that might have stepped from ancient legend, like the Hernistiri giant Cauldron of Wrath. His own great strength was still merely human. His enemy was something that God had turned from in disgust, a demon out of the ultimate darkness. Had I only a boar spear, something long and strong, I might keep it at bay while I continue to let its blood. But instead, he had come to this fight more like a sacrifice than an opponent. Did the wood witch ensorcel me to make me so careless? Did she send me here to die? In truth, why send me here at all instead of fairies with bows to pierce the thing from a great distance until it weakened and fell? But he had no time now to worry on these things. The monster, one head bobbing uselessly, but the other full of awful, glaring life, was stamping toward him again. This time, Chimerus's weary legs nearly let him down, and the beast almost caught him as he dove to one side. He rolled, and from his back struck a hard, slashing blow across the nearest broad wrist with his black sword, which shivered in his grasp as though in exultation at the taste of blood. Determined to take the fight back to his enemy, Chimerus again feinted at its clawed hand as it trudged toward him. But when it pulled its arm away, he leaped forward and stabbed at its belly, feeling relief when he actually struck something substantial. The creature let out a howl of fury, and he had to throw himself down and scramble between the giant's legs to avoid its furious grab, barely pulling his sword loose again. But he was too slow, and one great finger curled in his baldric. For a moment, Chimerus was trapped as the creature tried to pull him back between its legs. He knew that once the great hands closed on him, he was dead. But he could not reach the horn strap to free himself from it, so he dug his feet into the ground and pulled as hard as he could, even as the tightening baldric threatened to tear his arm from his shoulder. At last, just before he was dragged back into the giant's grasp, the baldric finally snapped, and Chimerus fell forward, then scurried out of reach before the monster could turn and seize him. Blood was welling from the wound on the giant's belly. Not enough to do much more than slow it, but the painful wound had unquestionably made his foe even more furious, more determined to catch him and rend him. But even through his exhaustion, his gasping breath, and the darkening of his vision, Chimerus had finally realized something. The creature did not fight like the one giant he had met before or any other he had heard of. Nearly everyone who had survived an encounter with the gigantic beasts spoke of their fierce, almost man-like cleverness. But this giant had seemed nothing more than an animal from the first, like an enraged boar or a goaded, hound-beset bear. No strategy to its attacks, but charging him over and over again. Thorn was almost humming in his hand, but for the moment he ignored the sword and its compelling bloodlust. Constantly retreating, he picked up and threw another stone, then yet another, aiming now for the giant's bleeding gut. The second stone struck hard, and the creature bent, its roar mixed with a shriek of outraged pain as harsh as the grating of a rusty hinge. For a heartbeat, Chimerus considered attacking again while it was distracted, but another part of him felt certain it was too soon, that if he risked a close attack now, it would be his last assault. Instead, he sprang to one side of the shelf of stone and grasped a branch of a dwarf oak tree, hacking it free with one stroke of the black sword, then held it high in his left hand like a banner. When the giant straightened and came thundering toward him again, he swatted it in the snarling face with the long branch. And while it clawed at the slapping twigs, he hacked hard at the back of its massive leg and then sprang away. This time, the blood did not merely seep, but coursed, bubbling like a mountain spring over the creature's calf, so that the giant left bloody footprints in the dirt and on the stones as it turned after him. The branch distracted it one more time, enough that he managed a stab into the creature's groin before dodging back. But the giant caught the branch and yanked it away. He could see something in the monster's eyes now that gave him a little hope. Vor Can Kurg looked confused as well as angry, a net of crooked wrinkles clenched under its shelf of brow as though it could not understand what had happened, why it was bleeding, why its enemy was not already dead and in its stomach. But Chimerus himself was so dizzy and weak that he could scarcely keep himself upright. As they circled each other again, both combatants were staggering, but the knight knew that the giant would not need more than a fraction of its strength to crush him like an overripe fruit if it caught him. The only way he could survive would be to outlast it, to give it more wounds, to stay alive as long as he possibly could. But Chimerus himself had countless bleeding gouges and other wounds from the thing's claws. His legs felt like pipes of suet, and on top of everything else, the last rays of the sun were all but gone. In mere moments, the hilltop would be in darkness. Now, he did something that would have astonished any observer. As he circled, staying away from the beast while keeping it moving, he pulled his mailed coif. From his head and threw it aside, reveling in the cool air that caressed his damp hair and skin, aware that it might be the last pleasurable sensation he ever experienced. If he had dared, he would have taken off his hauberk as well, but he knew he could not wrestle his tunic and the heavy armor over his head before the giant caught him. His enemy had slowed a little, gray tongue hanging from its wide, toothy mouth as it fought for air. But despite the blood that matted its belly and groin and puddled behind it as it moved, it was still standing. The last sunlight was glaring on the hill's crest. Chimerus knew that the time had come when he must wager everything on a last maneuver. He would stand no chance against this thing in darkness. And even if I somehow prevail, I still will likely die here on this hill. My ribs are cracked, and I have lost much blood too. He suddenly remembered what King John had said to him on the battlefield after his cruel trick, as Chimerus knelt retching and gasping before him, astounded by John's unseemly attack. Honor is a wonderful thing, but a king who falls on his sword with honor does not save his kingdom. Enough then, Chimerus thought, as he watched the fanged monster lumbering toward him once more. Does this murderous animal deserve an honorable fight? It favors the side with the head that sees. That is my only chance. As the giant stamped toward him again, he lowered Thorn and feinted at the monster's arm on the side closest to the snarling head, then spun and ducked under the great sweeping claw just before it caught him. He rolled toward its other side, sprang up, shoving one foot squarely into the bloody center of its wounded belly, and then vaulted upward as the monster roared in pain. He feinted a swing of the long blade toward the giant's growling, red-eyed head, but then twisted his arms in midair. His ribs and chest seemed to blaze like fire at the effort, and dealt a backhanded blow to the exposed neck of the blind, bobbing head instead. The giant reeled back, one great paw reaching for the terrible wound, as though to staunch the blood already gushing from its half-severed neck. Chimerus fell hard on his back, losing his wind, and for a moment could only lie and fumble for prayers, but his memory was empty, and his head was full of flashing clouds like a thunderstorm. He dragged himself onto his feet. The giant's right side was now slick with the blood, pumping and bubbling from its terrible wound, but the monster was still standing, and the staring eyes of the other head, full of animal rage, fixed on him. Clawed hands wide, it staggered toward him. Chimerus could barely lift up Thorn, though the huge beast was nearly upon him. He had time only to set the pommel against his breast, the blade pointed like a black finger at the creature's hairy, red-matted chest, and then the giant was upon him. The blade slid in so sweetly, Chimerus thought God must have smiled on him, showing him the place between two ribs. But even as the sword pierced him, the giant did not falter. Instead, it moved up the blade, forcing Thorn ever deeper into its own hairy body as the great arms folded around Chimerus and clutched him in an unbreakable grip, as though the mighty gates of the Sansellin Mahistrevis itself had closed on him. Only Thorn's crossguard kept him from being pulled all the way into the beast's stinking, hairy mass. But he felt his own chain mail piercing his skin through the arming shirt, his ribs bending and cracking as a red tide of pain rose inside him. Even as he felt his body dying, the gaping, fanged mouth swung toward his face until the yellow teeth had almost closed on his skull, and blackness swam before his eyes. Dying, he thought. Lord, I come to you. But suddenly the immense force of the arms diminished. The giant gurgled and blood vomited from between its teeth. Then the creature sucked in a horrid, gasping, choking breath. A moment later, Chimerus was flying through the air. He had time for a single ragged thought. Thank you, my God, for sparing me a coward's death, before something struck him with such violence that he passed into a darkness from which he knew he would never wake. But he did wake, or at least seemed to. He could no longer tell what was real and what was not. The sun was long gone. Stars wheeled in the black, black sky above him. He could see nothing but their piercing gleam. He was flattened against the ground as though he was about to slide off it, and something was under his hand. His fingers closed on it. A horn, he thought in dull surprise. This must be the day of weighing out. The horn of judgment must blow so all the souls can come to the Lord. He put it to his lips, summoned what air he could, though it felt as though he was all broken panes of glass inside, and he blew, the same call with which he had once summoned the troops of the Nabani Empire to their last futile skirmish. Then he slid back into darkness. He heard the horn in his dream, and its echoing blare stretched into a sound that had no beginning and no ending. something that might have begun before time itself and would continue on until the very hour when the world ended. The idea filled him with joy. He would finally meet the Lord his God. Nothing hurt anymore. He could not feel his wounded, broken body at all, and he was happy to leave it behind. Then a shadow fell across his stumbling thoughts. But I am a sinner. I have been cursed. My Lord will turn his back upon me. Opening his eyes seemed as difficult as lifting a great weight. When he managed at last, the motion and the flicker of many torches confused him. He thought he might still be on the hilltop where he had fought the monster, but all was dreamlike, uncertain. A crowd of slender immortals stood on either side of the cavern's entrance. A large shape lay just inside the cave, covered with something that sparkled even by torchlight like a spider web covered with dew. The scene looked strangely to him like a funeral, and for a moment Chimerus wondered if it might be his own. Have I died? But the fairies cannot put me to rest here. This is not sacred ground. There is no priest to sing the Mansa Sea Quelosen over me. I will be lost to God forever. But would God even care? Chimerus tried to rise, to tell the immortals of their mistake, though he was still not quite certain whether he watched from a distance or was in truth the lengthy dead shape beneath the scintillant shroud, but the effort was too much for him. A great weariness reached up and folded him in its soft, padded paws, then pulled him down again to a place where his thoughts no longer had words or even meaning. When he rose to wakefulness once more, Chimerus found himself stretched on a litter, being carried down a steep track in darkness by silent Scythi, with faces as expressionless as religious icons. If he was dead, as seemed undeniable, neither the Lord of Heaven nor his son, Eucyrus the Aedon, had come to claim him. He wondered in an addled way if it had something to do with being surrounded by these godless immortals. Pain and exhaustion pulled him in and out of darkness as they carried him down from the hill, and only the stars smoldering in the blackness above helped him distinguish between night and insensibility. The journey took forever, or seemed to. He could not help wondering whether he was being borne from one world to another, although he could not guess what worlds either might be. Everything ached. There's one of my friends calling to wish me happy birthday. I thought I'd turned the phone off. Everything ached. His chest, his legs, his arms, his head. But that, he supposed, meant he was truly alive. Heaven would not be so painful, and surely if his sins had brought him into the devil's clutches instead, his punishments would not be such trifling spites. You have returned to us, Sir Chimerus. For a moment his certainties vanished. He thought the one who spoke must be an angel, but he realized at last it was Amaterasu. She stood over him, the sun glowing through the trees above her, making a halo of light behind her head and hiding her expression, but her voice was kindly. You have fought a terrible foe and triumphed. I do not feel triumphant. Nor do I, she said gently. But that does not lessen the skill and bravery you showed. You took many wounds in the doing and were badly hurt, but Pt.2 and others have carefully tended you. She indicated a silver-haired Scytha woman sitting nearby, grinding something in a mortar. Now you must rest again. How long have I been aswoon? Since you fought the giant? A day, and another day. My horse, he said, trying to sit up. I left Atarin. We have brought him here, Amarasu assured him, touching his arm. Have no fear, he is quite comfortable with our own steeds. Unlike you, he took no harm. Chimera settled back, wishing now he had not moved so quickly. His ribs ached badly, but nowhere near as strongly as they should have. Could it really be only a day since that endless nightmare? It scarcely seemed real now. But then he remembered something else, something he had thought a dream. I saw a funeral, or so it seemed. He looked at her, half angry, half fearful. Did that truly happen, or did I dream it? You did not dream it. He could read nothing in her features. Was it for the giant? It was. Why, lady, why would you give such care to a monster? The hill is full of the bones of its victims. She put a cool hand against his forehead, startling him. Yes, I understand why you are troubled, but I thought you had other questions you wished to ask me, questions you risked your life to ask. Have you so soon forgotten about your sword and the errand that brought you to me? She spoke gently but firmly, as though to a callow youth. Chimerus could not help a moment of bruised pride. He might be a sinner and a fool, but he was no child, not even in comparison to these long-lived creatures. Could a child have killed the monster on the hilltop? I have not forgotten, my lady of the wood, he said, though I think now I regret our bargain. As is your right. Are you strong enough to speak now, or would you wait until you have rested another night? The Sitha healer named Kirathu seemed to have done the work of weeks of rest in but a pair of days. I can hear anything you tell me, I think. Hear? Yes. Understand? Quite possibly. But accept the truth. That we will wait to see. Amarasu bent, and for the first time he saw that thorn lay unsheathed at her feet. He fought a moment's strange jealousy as she lifted it. I will tell you a little of the sword's history, some of which is written upon it. She indicated the twining marks inlaid on the blade, which Chimerus had always thought a mere decoration. It was forged in what is called the founding year 168 in Naban, as you know. But those who forged this blade were not mortal Nabanai craftsmen, but Tenukadaya metalwrights, who we brought with us to this land out of the lost garden where we once lived. I do not know that name, Tenukadaya. You do not know the name, but if you come from Naban, you know their race, or at least some of them. The Niskis, the Sea Watchers, are of the Tenukadaya tribe. The Niskis? All Naban knew the secretive people and their strange songs that kept the dangerous creatures of the ocean at bay. No ship of any size went out without at least one of them on board. But I have never heard that they had anything to do with forging or smithing metal. They do not. All Niskis are Tenukadaya, but not all Tenukadaya are Niskis. The Tenukadaya are often called changelings because they wear many forms. The one you killed on the hilltop, Vorkan Kurg, he was another of the Tenukadaya race. For a moment, Chimerus was utterly confounded, certain he must have misunderstood. The giant? He asked at last. Do you tell me that Giants and Niskis are the same sort of beasts? Amarasu looked sadly at him. Not beasts, not even the giants. The Tanukadaya are not so different from your kind or mine. He waved his hand. I am benighted. What does all this have to do with Thorn, with my curse? Yes, your curse. She nodded slowly. You may have heard of another type of changeling, the Dueros, as they are called around this forest. The northern men call them Dvernings. The Hernestiri know them as Domhaini, but they are all different names for the same folk. They are diggers and builders, and the most skillful workers of rock and metal in this world. When the great star stone came blazing to earth in Naban, and the mortal imperator wanted it shaped into a sword, he called on his smiths, and they, in turn, called on the Druli, the Tanukadaya stonecrafters, as they are called in your country. The changelings created this blade from the heart of a fallen star. She ran her fingers along it as though she stroked a cat upon her lap. But I do not understand, lady. Do you mean these changelings created Thorn with unholy spells? Because it is no mere weapon. It is alive. I know that. I can feel it. This black sword hungers for battle like a hound yearns for the hunt. It quivers at my touch and almost sings when fighting comes. It loves nothing more than to deal death. God must have made me its owner to punish me, or hoped I would overcome its evil influence, but I have failed to do that. It is my curse. This time the Lady of the Wood watched his face for no little time before she spoke. And why would your God want to punish you? Chimerus shook his head violently, ignoring the pain of his wounds. I do not know. I have struggled to live by the Book of Adon all my life, to do right to friend and enemy alike, not to covet or lust or steal. I have killed. Yes, may God preserve me, but only in defense of the innocent, or in just war for my king. As she watched him, her expressionless face seemed to mock his life of suffering. The golden empty faces of Amarasu and all her servitors kindled a fire of rage inside him, so that for a moment he could almost imagine snatching back Thorn and destroying them all for their quiet certainty, for their dismissal of his pain. But the fury passed as swiftly as a hot wind. I have always done my best to be God's servant, he said slowly. But the sword plagues me with its hunger for battle. Amarasu put both hands on the black blade. If you are certain you are cursed, Sir Chimerus, then that is a mystery I cannot unriddle. I suspect no one can but you. He stared at the sword where it sat across her lap. It was seldom so long out of his possession, and seeing her with it made him oddly fretful. But what unholy power fills it? Why does it torment me with its needs? I feel as though I am yoked to a demon. How could that be anything but a curse? Again, that is not for me to say. But I can tell you one thing about it, mortal man, that I hope will bring you a little peace. Yes, there is life in this blade. I too can feel it. But it is not the life of the dark things that lurk beyond death you feel, or the power of some demon. Rather, it is the life of the dreaming sea. He could only stare, first at her, then at the blade. dreaming sea. I do not know of such a place. No, you do not, because it was not of these lands, and it no longer exists. It surrounded the garden whence my people came. But the Pt.2 brought some of its waters with them when we fled, in casks and jars, as did my own kins, the ones you know as Norns. Chimerus had not known the golden Scythian and the murderous white-skinned Norns were related, but he was already full of confusion. I still do not understand any of what you are telling me. The dreaming sea was not a sea as you know it. It was not merely full of living things as the oceans of Ostenard. It was itself alive. Because of that, it was and is sacred to the Pt.2. And because of that, they used it sparingly, always sparingly, in their most important tasks. I doubt not that this blade, when the star metal had been hammered into shape but still glowed with the blazing heat of the forge, was quenched by its makers in the waters of the dreaming sea, waters brought out of the garden during our escape so long ago. He could not entirely make sense of what she said. So the sword is alive because it was bathed in the waters of a magical ocean from some faraway land? That is what I suppose. She smiled at him. At first, he saw mockery again, but after a moment realized it might be nothing more than pity. But there are some answers about this sword that you alone can find, I think. You likened it to a hunting hound. Does the hound only bark and bound because it wishes to sink its teeth in soft throats and to taste blood? Or does it sense the master's excitement for the chase? Perhaps the hound is excited most of all simply by the chance to live, to do what it was made for. His cheeks felt hot. If you claim that the bloodlust of this blade is only a reflection of my own, I must reject you and your counsel, lady. I do not live to kill. I hate fighting. I live only to do God's will. I cannot argue, mortal knight, she said. I had heard tales of you, and now I have met you, but I do not pretend to know you. Take my words and consider them. Perhaps they will help lead you to wisdom, and perhaps they will not. But I have told you all I can. She stood, and he realized she had been crouching at his side for a very long time. Now, rest. Tomorrow I think you will be fit enough to return to the world of men. Something was still pulling at him, and he lifted a hand to summon her back, but then felt he had overstepped. Amarasu had said she was no queen, but he did not think she told the whole truth, and her presence still abashed him. Another question, my lady, if you will be so kind. She did not seat herself again, but waited, standing beside him. Why? Why did you give burial honors to the giant? He asked. Why did you wrap him in a gleaming shroud and put him back in his cave like some ancient king? For the first time since he had been on the hilltop, he saw true, unmistakable sadness on the Lady of the Woods' ageless face. Because, in a way, he was. For Kankurg was one of the oldest and largest of his kind, bred in the deeps of Stormspike, as part of the foul workings of Queen Utuku's sorcerers. But he escaped from our immortal kins, the ones you men call Norns, a long time before you were born, and made his way south to this forest. When my people fled here, I made a bargain with him. A bargain? With a mindless, deadly beast? She shook her head. I agreed that our people would leave him in peace, that we would never trespass on his hill and the lands around it while he lived. And he, in turn, promised that he would harm none of our folk, or even the mortals who lived on the forest's edge, that he would hunt only the beasts of the forest for his meals. But how could you make a pact with one who could not speak? I saw him, lady. He was a murderous beast with no thought but killing. That is the Vorkan Kurg you saw, yes, but he was not always that way. Once he spoke and thought just as you and I do now. The oldest of the giants can often speak. They are not mere animals, as I told you, but another sort of changeling. Do not forget that Vorkan Kurg had 2 heads, the legacy of something terrible done when he was bred in the depths of Utuku's dark mountain. Always the second head was nothing more than bestial, as you saw. But as an elder brother may master a younger, so Khan's nature was that of his wiser head. But then, a few seasons ago, something happened. The wise head died, leaving only his brute side alive. The brute head became master of the giant's body. Like a mad king, Chimaris said, trying to imagine such a horror. That is fearfully apt. Her voice now seemed full of some memory that he could not share. And that was the terrible choice that faced me. I had sworn an oath to Vorkan Kurg, not just to one part of him. I had told him he could live free on his hill all his life, safe from my people. So you sent me to kill him instead, said Chimaris, his voice bitter. A mortal whose honor had no meaning to you. Honor? You made no pledge to him, mortal. Her words seemed brittle, sharp as icicles. And you came to me seeking wisdom, which I have given you. In return, you did what I could not, and have made the lands all around a safer place. When she spoke again, it was more softly. And the truth of it, Chimaris Benedrivis, exile of Vinita, is that you have done a kindness here. I cannot think that the giant I knew, who fled when my Hikedaya kin planned to use him as a weapon against their enemies, would have wanted to live as a scourge and a monster. Whether you see it now or not, you have done a great deed, a kind deed. Chimaris was weary and dizzy with all the names and old stories. If you say so, my lady. My heart is not so easily soothed, I fear. And that, I suspect, will always be your true curse, she said slowly, fixing him with her deep gold-flecked eyes. You will never live up to what you expect from yourself, but never question what those expectations are. Enough, I beg you. I am too tired to think. I beg your pardon, but I must sleep now. Then I will go. But we will speak again one last time before you take your leave. When the sun at last found its way through the trees the following morning, Amarasu's quiet followers led Atarin to him. The powerful gray looked rested and well-fed, his coat shining as if newly brushed. I guess that you at least might like to stay with these forest fairies, battle brother, he said as he made the horse's harness a little tighter than the Scythe had left it. And you, I am guessing, would not. He turned to see Amarasu. Her arms, in their draped sleeves, were folded around something. I do not belong among such complicated folk as yours, he said. I thank you for keeping your bargain, although I am sorry now that I took it, because I fear I have learned nothing that makes me feel more hopeful. Then perhaps you have not listened closely enough to all that I told you. She smiled as if to soften the harshness of her words. Here, I suspect this is some old family treasure. You fell on it after you winded it. For a moment he could only stare at what she held. At last he took the broken pieces of his battle horn from her. It is no treasure, he said, only the keepsake of a few defeats and a few dubious victories. Then do with it as you will. In any case, I have a presentiment that you will receive another one someday, a greater one. Her words seemed full of pointless significance. His wounds might have largely healed, but they had been replaced by a terrible weariness that seemed to touch even his soul. If you say so, my lady. I do. And it is as the Saansara, I tell you, whether you hear me or not. But grant me a few last words in any case. Remember, Sir Chimerus, no matter where your singular destiny may take you, it is not the broken promises to others that burn a life to ashes, but the broken promises made to oneself. She stepped forward. Without thinking, he bowed, and she kissed him lightly upon his forehead. Go in the light of the garden. Within moments, Amaterasu and all her followers had slipped into the trees and vanished like morning mist. Chimerus stood in the new emptiness for a long time, thinking. Birds at last began to twitter again in the trees. Come, old friend, he said as he swung himself up into Atarin's saddle. We've a long way back to the Hayholt, and I have much to consider. He turned the horse to the south and clicked his tongue. Then together they left the wood. And that is the end of the story. And what time are we? We're getting up toward the top of the hour. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. It's also, I think, an interesting story because, as I've been doing ever since starting the Witchwood Crown project, which is the whole schmear, the whole lump, I've been trying to explain some of the background history of Ostenard, and a lot of this stuff I had already thought about when I was writing the original trilogy 30 years, whatever, ago. More than that now. Very, very much. For instance, I always knew that there were many kinds of Tanuka Daya, and that the giants and the Niskis and the Kilpa and even the Gants are all changelings from their inheritance. Although very different, some of them much less, for lack of a better words, much less human than others. But all of them, my basic feeling is about anything that has sort of the, excuse the modern expression, sort of the DNA of the dreaming sea in it, moves slowly over time and generations towards becoming more person-like. But then other factors are involved as well in terms of how person-like the creatures become. So that's why the older giants are the only ones that can talk. Why, if there are perhaps Kilpa or others who live long enough, they may get beyond their animality and become more person-like. Whereas others, for whatever reasons, because of their own heritage, how they began to differentiate already back in the garden, etc., like the Niskis, are basically people. They're Tanuka Daya, but they are people-like. They think like people, they feel like people, that although they contain the sense of connection that everything born out of the dreaming sea has, they also have individuality. They are individuals in a way that, say, perhaps the Gants are not. And certainly the Dreaming Sea originally was not. The Dreaming Sea was almost like, I think, like one sort of complex organism. Not quite a hive mind, but not quite all one thing either. Not a single person, in other words, but, you know, a gestalt entity, which probably dates back to things like Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human, just to talk about sources for a moment. Anyway, so that's one of the things, and that's one reason I'm glad I finally got a chance to read that story to some of you who have, most of you who have not heard it before, because one of the things that I've most enjoyed about going back to Ostenard was to get a chance to bring out some of the old stuff that I had not really squeezed into the first books, because you can only squeeze in so much history and background, and to discover some new stuff, because that is also very, very much the case, that you cannot anticipate everything when you're building a world as, you know, fairly complicated like Ostenard. I mean, there's only a few works of fiction at this point that are larger larger endeavors at creating an alternate world. You know, I mean, it's the Dune books and Tolkien and, you know, some of the other writers who are my contemporaries. You know, there's not a huge amount of us doing this stuff. But one of the fascinating things, and one of the things that's always made me really excited about writing big books, and one of the reasons I still go back to them, even though they're maddening in some ways, but they have a kind of an emergent order that comes out of the chaos, and you find yourself making choices on pure instinct sometimes. You know, like, I don't know why this should happen now, but I'm going to put it in, and by the time I get to the end of this novel, I think I'll know why. And usually that is the case. And this is especially important, which those of you who've heard me do readings, I often get asked about, how do you plan your books? You know, do you outline the whole thing first, or do you make it up as you go along? Are you, you know, a pantser, or as George Martin put it, you know, are you a pantser or are you an architect? Meaning, by pantser means you fly by the seat of your pants. And one of the things about writing these long multi-volume stories is that by the time you're finishing the story, the early volumes may very well be published, and it's too late. It's too late to do anything to fix them if you get something wrong. So you have to make good choices, and you have to leave certain things open-ended. And then you have to trust that the order will emerge out of the chaos, or of the apparent chaos, because just as no chaos is complete and there's always emergent order, once you get to that emergent order, there's probably emergent chaos underneath it, and so on and so forth, turtles all the way down. So that's one of the things I like about these big books, is that they begin not to write themselves, God forbid. I wish they did. That would be so much easier. But the worlds begin to suggest things to you, and the connections begin to crop up. And largely, you know, a lot of material comes just out of the process of writing. I think I've told this story before, and this will be the last one I say, I think, before we wrap it up for the night. But for instance, for those of you who have read the first trilogy, the Dragonbone Chair, Stone of Farewell to Green Angel Tower, when I was working on the first volume, all those many, many years ago, I had no idea that Cadrak, the monk, the drunken monk, the drunken crisis of conscience, religious failure, drunken monk, was going to be any kind of serious character. I literally thought I was inventing him just for the scene where Simon meets him at the marketplace in Market Row, Market Square, in Urchester, and then after hanging around with Cadrak for a while, discovers that Cadrak has picked his pocket, and then meets him later on at an inn after escaping from the Hayholt. That's after Simon gets out of the Hayholt. He meets Cadrak later on. And that was as far as I thought about it. I was like, you know, Simon's going to chase this guy and be all angry and upset with him and not catch him. And it's kind of evidence of how Simon is stuck in the world, lost in the world. and can't trust anybody. Then I got near the end of the Dragonbone chair, and Miriamel was running away from Naglamund. I assume these aren't spoilers at this point, since this book has been out since the late 1980s. But Miriamel's running away from Naglamund, but I didn't want her on her own for a variety of reasons. One of the most obvious being that it's a lot easier to make things happen if there are two characters or more who can share information with each other, but also because when you have a long stretch of travel, if you have more than one character involved, the interaction between the characters is oftentimes one of the most interesting things, if not the most interesting thing. So you are dealing with your travel bits or dealing with your expository lumps, as we sometimes say, of history or plot or whatever, through the method, through the medium of character interaction, and specifically oftentimes, like in the case of Miriamel and Cadrak, very, very frustrated with each other, angry, upset, with moments of sympathy and all this. And it became this quite interesting projected environment for me to work with. And so as I thought more about it, I went, okay, well, if I'm going to keep Cadrak in at least into the second book, when Mary finally winds up in the band, who is he? And that's when you start seeing the emergent order. I'm going, here's Cadrak. He's a drunk. He's a complete failure as a monk, or as a religious person in any way, shape, or form. He's become a thief. He clearly is a messed up individual with a real feeling of failure and lack about himself. How did that happen? What would be sensible? And the more you think about it, the more you say, well, I can think of a really good reason that would fit right in with the plot, which is that he was part of the League of the Scroll at the time that Priorides came in, and maybe even had something to do with bing, 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 and then all of the dominoes begin to tip each other over, and before you know it, you have a character who becomes very significant, and without, again, giving anything away, remains in the story pretty much all the way to the end. So that's how these things work. And that's one of the reasons that it's fun to share some of the background history, because a lot of the things that are mentioned in this story, just for instance, are going to come up in the Navigator's Children. And so those of you who are waiting for me to finish Navigator's Children, there's a lot about the Dreaming Sea, and the Tanuka Daya. And who knows, there may be some more stuff about Chimeras and Amaterasu as well. So that's how it all works. Anyway, with that, I have now taken you a few minutes past, and I think, if I'm lucky, the food has arrived upstairs. So I am going to go eat my birthday dinner. I wish a happy day to all the rest of you. Thank you for all the kind birthday wishes. I've really enjoyed hearing from so many people, and I am, what can I say? I'm extremely grateful. I am a grateful, lucky guy, and I always know that. And so thank you for all your kindnesses. Take care of yourselves, take care of the people around you, your loved ones, but take care of the people just in your vicinity as well, because they need help too. We're going to get through this whole thing, and when we get out the other side, we're going to have fun. We're going to party like it's 1999 all over again. Anyway, thank you very much. Lovely to see you, and have a great